One of the repercussions from boundaries that are not being managed well is poor health.
So sometimes that fear is literally just your brain trying to keep you safe.
We may not be aware that it's a boundary until it gets crossed.
Mm-hmm. Welcome back to Unapologetic Rabble-Rousers. I'm DocShellie.
And I'm Carla. And we are going to be wrapping up our segment that has been focusing on boundaries. We want to leave this conversation having reviewed really some of the evidence when boundaries are being mismanaged, so that we can perhaps provide some ways for people to look at and maybe filter through the experiences they're having to say, wow, might this be one of those boundaries that either I'm not managing well or that I seem to be tromping on for somebody else, and that this is the result of that. So being able to talk about that and then address how do we repair a broken boundary.
Yes. I liked your words, tromping on. I think sometimes we tromp on boundaries that we don't even know about.
And we talked a bit about that.
We've already covered that, but that word tromp just kind of got me. So when you think about crossing boundaries and management or mismanagement of boundaries, what are some things that we should look for? What's some evidence that we should collect?
I think we have talked about this both from the personal point of view and professional or workplace point of view. And while we could put a few things in either one of those columns, it wouldn't be hard to stretch your mind around the fact that we have boundaries everywhere, and differentiating between the two ends up getting things muddy, because we have to recognize that we have boundaries. Yes, we have personal ones, we have professional ones. When those start getting confused, might that even be a part of the problem? I'm trying to handle my professional relationships with boundaries that work for my personal relationships, as a for instance. But let's talk about it from a personal point of view. What might be some of the repercussions that either as you're seeing it in yourself or you're experiencing it for another person, a friend, family member, whatever, is exhibiting things. Like, let's start with burnout. When you have poor management of the boundaries around how you exert your time or how you spend your time, how you exert your energy, the responsibilities that you take on, if you're not honoring boundaries there, you get this workload pile up. Mm-hmm. And that's both professional and personal. And that's going to lead to burnout.
Yeah, I think about boundaries for work-life balance and how many people today, especially with all the technology we have, how accessible we are, many of us are required to be on 24/7. And it's hard to find that work-life balance, which is often a boundary for people.
I would argue that there are some of us who have lost sight of the fact that there really are and should be boundaries.
Absolutely.
So that we're on 24/7 because we can be. Sometimes we're on because the demand is there, but being able to separate that out. We all got a big taste of that when COVID first closed down, being together in an office setting, for instance, keeping family members apart. The stories we could go through about the impacts that in particular had on boundary management.
Oh, absolutely.
So we learned a lot about how to become aware of and then manage the distinction between family and work, mm-hmm. because it was all in one place.
Right.
Oh my goodness. So there's that. And then there's another repercussion that comes from mismanagement of boundaries, and that would be resentment.
Ooh, I know.
So in resentment, if somebody has overstepped a boundary, there's conflict that gets set up. And So as you take a look around, say, okay, is what I'm feeling right now, or is what I'm feeling from this other person right now, perhaps related to a boundary that isn't being managed well?
And I would add to that, sometimes we're not aware of a boundary that we've maybe crossed. And all of a sudden, somebody has a different attitude towards us. They're giving you the so called cold shoulder, avoiding, being very short or curt in their conversations with you. That's a great time to examine what is going on here, what kind of boundaries were potentially crossed. And sometimes we don't know other people's boundaries, sometimes we do. So we'll talk in a couple minutes about what to do when those boundaries are crossed.
And it does get back to, we've talked before about, we have the spoken, the conscious boundaries, and then we have these unspoken ones. We may not be aware that it's a boundary until it gets crossed.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see that happening around you. You can probably see that happening through you. And so what we will talk about are some steps to take, some awareness to bring into the situation to be able to repair that. If we move on from resentment and we go into your own self-care, one of the repercussions from boundaries that are not being managed well is poor health. Physical, mental. If you are not taking care of self, if you're not keeping yourself safe, you can't help but suffer from that.
Yeah, emotionally, you can have emotional repercussions, physical, psychological. Like, there's a lot of different ways that continued violation of boundaries or boundary crossing can impact your health.
Yes. And then next, and maybe last on the list, on the personal side, not that it's the only, these are the only repercussions from poor management of boundaries, but sticking with the last one being, in some sense, isolation. So if you are maintaining very rigid boundaries, and maybe by choice, you're doing this because you really prefer to be isolated as opposed to really a part of and engaged. But that also leads to lack of support. So if you isolate, if you have rigid boundaries and you need support, but people know more about how to not be with you than they do to be with you.
Yeah, when you make it hard for other people to connect with you, it's hard then when you do need the support to reach out. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, it's hard to reach out to begin with. But when you've already set up those boundaries where I don't want people to get too close, I like to be by myself, I don't want whatever to show, then when you have to reach out for assistance, it makes it really difficult.
And there's another piece to that as well, and that would be isolation because of fear.
Mm-hmm.
If you've been in a situation where you did not feel safe, you want to protect yourself. I mean, this is you taking care of you in a way, but as you're looking around you, the people that matter to you, and you see someone apparently isolating in a way that they haven't before, is it a boundary between the two of you, or is it something that's going on for that person? And this might be a great time for you to do some of that leaning in mm-hmm. and that listening that we've talked about in previous episodes.
And I think it's important, too, to understand fear sometimes is just our brains at work. It's that neuroplasticity at work of this happened, and so I'm going to continue to protect myself. And sometimes we have to retrain our brain to do something different than what we've always done. And our brain may freak out a little bit when we start to do something differently. But when we have done it a couple of times, your brain will settle down and think, okay, this is okay. I don't have to freak out right now. So sometimes that fear is literally just your brain trying to keep you safe. And you have to overcome that.
So let's look at it also from the standpoint of a professional or workplace related mismanagement of boundaries. The first one that comes out would be productivity.
Productivity.
Okay, so
it's going to tank.
And the reason is that without when we are not honoring the boundaries we've established around doing the work that we're there to do, we get distracted. We can't maintain the focus that we need. So you think about the boundaries you set up for how you can be most effective in the work that you're doing, and what happens when those boundaries aren't being honored by you or by those around you.
Right.
That's a problem.
That is a problem. I think it's really important, particularly in the workplace. There are times where you may willingly violate your own boundaries around, maybe it's something as simple as I don't work through lunch, or I don't eat lunch at my desk. I take a half-hour break, whatever it is. And there may be times where you compromise that willingly. But did you have a conversation with the person about it? Because what I've noticed is when people see you violate your own boundary, people make an assumption, consciously or subconsciously, that your boundary has shifted and it is now okay for these things to happen. So I remember having a conversation with somebody one time. I was playing tennis and I needed to leave work on whatever day it was, Tuesdays by 5:30. I'm not going to miss tennis. Boundary. Tennis is a great stress reliever for me when I was playing. And they scheduled a meeting that went till 6:00. And I said, I'm leaving at 5:00. I have to be at the courts by 5:30. And I got talked into, well, can you just stay this one time? So I got a sub for tennis that night. And then every Tuesday, why can't you stay? You stayed last time. And I made it really clear that that was a one-time thing. Violating my own boundary. I restated what my boundary was and told them I would do it this one time. But then they continued to ask me to continue to violate that boundary. And I never did it again.
It's when we allow a chink in the armor.
Yep.
People are real quick to grab onto there's an opening. There's something that used to be rigid and now is not.
Yeah, for 100 times you said no, and the one time you said yes, they're going to latch onto that one time. Well, you said yes last time.
Nobody listening to this has ever
no one's
experienced
ever done that.
No. Okay. So another boundary mismanagement repercussion, especially in the professional world, is going to be loss of trust.
Yeah, I think that happens in both spaces. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard to recover from that loss of trust and that violation or even the erosion of potentially of the relationship that happens when boundaries are crossed in a manner that just says, I completely disrespect you and your choices.
Mm-hmm. And when we get to talking about what we do when these things happen, we're going to be calling on a number of the skills and awarenesses that we've been discussing up to this point in order to be able to address, because sometimes you just don't know that you just did something. That other person may not recognize that they just did something,
right.
An egregious violation of a boundary.
When people see you violate your own boundary, people make an assumption that your boundary has shifted and it is now okay for these things to happen.